Hi, everyone. Welcome to today's panel on trade connectivity. I'm Chun Wei. I'm Research Director for the Hinrich Foundation. It's great to have everyone here today in this beautiful venue. I understand that we have about 100 virtual participants tuning in. It's great to be here. It's a beautiful museum, and it's such an honor to be doing it alongside an amazing exhibition of Manila Galleons, which is curated under the directorship of Kenny Ting. Thanks very much, Kenny. The Manila Galleons were for 3 centuries a technological innovation and projection, a commercial and military means of projecting like Spain's imperial power. They are obviously also a story of colonialism, and along with it, the darker side of economic exploitation. But there's also a sort of more positive expression of that. The galleons were also a story of exchange. They were about the exchange of porcelain, silver, textiles from the New World and China, where Manila was really the sort of pivot point. And along with it, an exchange of ideas and culture and people. And at this point, it might be useful for me to talk a little bit about Hinrich Foundation and how we relate to all this. The Foundation's mission is to advance global sustainable trade. And when we say sustainable, we mean it more than just about ESG. It's always been more about ESG. It's about managing trade well, and managing trade in a way that is schooled in mutual benefit, and it has a fundamental orientation toward openness, and it's rooted in trust. And that's important today because we live in challenging times, obviously. As we speak, negotiators in Geneva are trying to negotiate the WTO out of dysfunction. We have a multilateral trading system that is in disorder. We have a spiral of protectionism, of retaliation, of coercion, of industrial policy. And really, these are all issues that my 3 distinguished expert panelists are going to talk about today. We're very fortunate to have them as we try and figure out how smaller economies are trying to figure their way out of this mess. So Debbie Elms is our Hinrich Foundation's head of trade policy. I think most people here know her as the Asian Trade Center. She was the Asian Trade Center, and that it was a representative of vast repository of knowledge and insight on trade policy in this region. She has a distinguished resume. She was held senior positions in the World Economic Forum, with APCO, with Temasek. The number of acronyms that she's worked with is just unbelievable. Beside her, we have Serena Liau. Serena very quietly plays a pivotal role in keeping Singapore alive and relevant. She directs, she leads, and she helps to implement Singapore's development of its first of its kind government-to-government agreements on green economy, on green trade, and that means clean energy, it means carbon flows, it means anything to do with the green and transition finance. These are the things that are going to keep us alive in this new age. She leads the implementation of the Singapore-Australia Green Economy Agreement, and she's leading the negotiation of the clean economy pillar of IPEF. So Serena was educated at the NUS, National University of Singapore, as well as the University of Otago in New Zealand. And that's what binds her to the next distinguished panelist that we have, Stephen Jacobi, who is Executive Director of the New Zealand International Business Council. He's not just a representative of business, he's also a long-time diplomat. He was Assistant Trade Commissioner in Paris. He was a private secretary to Jim Sutton, the former Minister for Trade Negotiations, and he was Deputy High Commissioner in Ottawa for New Zealand. He didn't quite make, to our misfortune, he didn't quite make High Commissioner to Singapore, but that's Debbie. Thanks for coming, Debbie. Again, Gabby. So these are the 3 panelists that we have today. Stephen is going to talk about the Southern Link, which is a very granular way in which New Zealand is trying to figure its way out of this mess that we're in. Before we get to that level, let's go back up to 18,000 feet, and we'll have Debbie sort of kick us off with an overview of where we stand today.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for that kind introduction, and thank all of you for being here today in person, and those of you who are online for joining us. It's an honor to be, especially in this building, with the Manila Galleon exhibit, and I'm delighted to see so many of you who are here with the red stickers indicating that you're going to be taking the tour after this. The advantage of the Manila Galleon as an exhibit, to me, for an event like this, is that it's a demonstration of trade in action. And when you go around and you look at the various pieces that have been pulled together for this exhibit, you will realize it's about an early exchange of goods, including textiles, silver, furniture, money, pieces of money, etc. It's an exchange of people, as we had individuals going back and forth between different and very diverse markets. It was an exchange of ideas, which is partly why when you see the Galleon exhibits, I think you will recognize similar sort of patterns or forms or craft in one location that ends up somewhere else. And I think that's nicely, and I will say thank you very much for this exhibit. It was beautifully curated. It's a really nice, the exhibit itself pulls out those connections between the materials, the people, the ideas, the craft, to illustrate what early forms of trade looked like. Of course, this is not our first experience with trade, the Manila Galleons themselves, but it's a nice, clear example that this is not new. That globalization, as we would call it today, has been going on for quite some time. And over all that time, of course, it comes and goes. We have ups and downs. We appear to be in a down pattern now, and if you read the media especially, a lot of the stories are all depressing. Gloom, deglobalization, the end of society as we know it. Carbon is going to be a disaster, you're going to fry, your children aren't going to survive. I mean, it's just some depressing things that are going on in the news. But I would say, actually, it's not, from my perspective, especially in trade and trade policy, it's not as gloomy as all of that. And while we like to say that we are being deglobalized, that supply chains have been really disrupted, the trade flow figures actually show that we're more or less back to where we were during COVID. We've had some changes, certainly, in our patterns of behavior. We have trade flows that were less prominent going into COVID that are much more prominent now. We have trade flows that are completely new, and especially for all of us in this room, an explosion in digital connectivity and digital applications and so forth, which has made a difference to most of us, I think, here and online. We certainly would not have had, or we would not have thought as easily about a hybrid event pre-COVID as we have thought about it now. And so I think it's a nice illustration, again, of how, even though we may say that we are more disconnected than ever, we're actually in many ways more connected than ever. And so that gives us some opportunities, and I'm just going to finish my opening remarks because I don't want to talk too long in the first period of this. There's some real opportunities for countries, governments, businesses, and even citizens to help shape what is that next period of trade and globalization going to look like. And one of the things that I find most exciting, actually, about working on trade policy questions is trying to shape that environment. What is it that we would like to see? What is it that we don't want to see? And how can we get government policies in place that help us get to where we would like to go, that deliver benefits to the largest number of people in the largest number of places, that leads to jobs and economic growth, and that avoids many of the damages that we may find if growth is disrupted, if trade gets cut off, or if we choose the wrong policies. Because it's very easy, especially in a digital world, to choose the wrong policy and make catastrophic unintended consequences come true. And so I think this is an interesting time for all of us, certainly, as we navigate what is new, evolving, uncertain, but there are real pockets of opportunity. And my last point that I'll just make is, because you were going to ask about small countries, one of the advantages that a place like Singapore and other small countries, New Zealand, et cetera, they have is a renewed possibility of influencing outcomes. Because in a time of disruption, when the old order is less stable, there are new places for countries as small as Singapore and New Zealand to engage and to be thought leaders and to be able to drive new thinking along the lines of, I guess, the Manila Galleon, to go back to that, and develop some interesting ways to solve problems of the future. So I'm not actually pessimistic at the moment. I think it's a time of optimism, especially for a place like Singapore, which is so interconnected, has been, and has incredible resources, particularly in its people, to think about that future and what that holds.
Thank you, Debbie. One of the things that I found striking in what you just said was that trade flows are changing. They're not actually shrinking. We just published a deep dive by Oxford Economics, which makes exactly that point. They took an econometric analysis of what was happening out there and found that, in fact, this myth, this idea that there's deglobalization going on is not quite correct. So it's something to download, when you guys go back. It's a very interesting look at how supply chains are shifting and they're changing, but they're not actually shrinking. People are finding innovative new ways of trying to get around it. And speaking of innovative new ways, the green economy is one of them. So Serena, you lead Singapore in developing and designing these things. So do you want to spend a little bit of time talking about it?
Yep. Thanks, Chun-Wei, for giving me the floor. So for my segment, I'd like hopefully to shed a bit of light about what green economy agreements are. And so before I delve into the Singapore-Australia GA, which is the first GA that we signed with Australia, I'd first like to take a step back. Maybe it would be helpful for me to also share what GAs are and how we envisage them contributing to international decarbonization efforts. So for us, what we do see is that GAs are similar in concept to free trade agreements and digital economy agreements. Essentially, these are trade tools that we have employed to help our companies expand their operations overseas, facilitate trade and investment with their overseas partners, and to do so in a manner with as few barriers as possible. And the difference between these three agreements is the type of flows that they cover. So I will begin to explain. I'll go in turn explaining what are the flows that each of the agreement covers before I go to GAs. So for free trade agreements, I think as some of you may know, they arose out of difficulties in reaching agreement at the WTO. Some of you may be aware, at the WTO there are more than 160 countries, and in order to make progress on any agreement, a consensus will need to be reached. And you can imagine how difficult that would be. So a natural consequence of that would be for like-minded countries to come together, find an arrangement between themselves to liberalize trade more quickly. And this has given birth to the FTAs. So the scope of the FTAs is similar to the free trade agreements. They cover traditional bread and butter issues like goods, services, investment, people, and data. The modern scope of FTAs have increased, and they've also included new topics such as e-commerce and competition. For Singapore, we have started our free trade journey more than 20 years ago, and since then we've gone on to sign many more FTAs. I think the total count stands at 27 FTAs, covering about 85% of the global GDP. And now this brings me to the second international trade tool that we have, which is the digital economy agreements. So in the last 5 years or so, what we have seen is a proliferation of online platforms and businesses transacting through virtual means. And what this means is that companies are now adopting digital tools to reach their customers worldwide and also employing flexible working arrangements through digital means. So what I've come to recognize is that digitalization is here to stay. With respect to DAs, they cover data and e-commerce. And similar to FTAs, the DAs enable companies to expand their operations overseas by addressing challenges that they face in the digital world. And this would include examples such as forced localization of data, disclosure of source code, or fragmented rules on data protection. By addressing these challenges, what the DAs hope to achieve is to lower operational costs, increase business efficiency, and enhance their access to overseas markets. So now I come to the GAs. In the last 3 years or so, especially from the COVID-19, since the COVID-19 period, what we've seen is a growing desire to address climate change effects. I think there's a growing recognition that the effects of climate change are not necessarily confined to those who consume more resources. And so there is a greater impetus for countries to come together and collaborate so as to address the climate change effects together. In recent years, we're also seeing developments in the energy and carbon world that is making the traditional trade-off between economic growth and sustainability becoming less of a concern. So in terms of energy, there are now new forms of energy such as zero or low carbon energy sources that are proving to be strong contenders as alternative fuels. And these would include hydrogen, ammonia, as well as biofuels. In terms of carbon capture and storage is an example of an option that we're exploring to reduce the amount of carbon in the atmosphere. Under the Paris Agreement, countries are also, they may purchase carbon credits from another country to offset their carbon emissions if such an arrangement is in place. So with all these new developments, what we are seeing here is a growing possibility that achieving sustainability and a good standard of living can go hand in hand. And what we want to achieve is to maintain that momentum with the GAs. We believe that GAs are able to achieve the twin objectives of accelerating countries' decarbonization efforts, as well as supporting economic growth in the green sector. So similar to the FTAs and DEAs that I just mentioned, the aim of our GAs is to help our companies engage in cross-border trade and investment in a seamless manner as possible in the green sector. And to achieve this, we have envisaged the GAs to achieve a number of things. First is to foster rules and standards to promote trade and investment in environmental goods and services. Secondly, we would like to enable and remove barriers to cross-border green economic activities. Third, we would like the GAs to develop interoperability between policy frameworks that can support new growth sectors and reduce operational costs. And finally, we would like the GAs to catalyze development of R&D, market making, and pilot projects in emerging green growth sectors. So Singapore, Australia was our first GA, and together with Australia, we had envisaged the scope of the collaboration of the GA to be wide-ranging and to cover a number of sectors. So if you have the chance to actually read the Singapore-Australia GA, which is publicly available, you will see that the areas of collaboration extend from traditional trade-related issues, such as trade investment, standards and conformance, building business partnerships, to new areas of collaboration in the green sector, such as green and transition finance, carbon markets, and clean energy. So beyond setting out the areas of cooperation, what Singapore and Australia have also done is to agree on a set of green economy principles that would guide and underpin our cooperation. So some examples of these principles would be: we agree to take action on climate change in a way that promotes and does not restrict trade, investment, and business. We agree to deploy data and evidence-based analysis in implementing our measures. And we continue to affirm our commitments in free trade agreements and other multilateral agreements that we're party to, such as WTO and UNFCCC. So maybe just a short note about our working relationship with Australia. I think it has been a very positive one. I'm not saying this because I know some people in the audience are my working counterparts, but we do have a very good, strong working relationship, and it has enabled us to conclude our agreement since its announcement within 1 year. At the moment, we are now continuing the good working relationship in the implementation phase, and both sides are working hard to flesh out the areas of cooperation progressively over time. So this is not the traditional agreement where nothing is closed until everything is closed. What we've adopted is a flexible approach that allows us to remain nimble to ongoing developments and make headway as and when the opportunity arises. So in this regard, we were quite pleased to be able to make 3 announcements at last year's annual leaders meeting. Allow me to share. The first would be the launch of the Asian Climate Solutions Grant, and this provides funding to support new innovative blended finance solutions for climate change. The second one was the announcement of a Go Green Co-Innovation Program. This is a fund that provides funding to Australian and Singapore SMEs, which have jointly developed innovative financial sustainable solutions. And finally, we also announced the intent to establish a green and digital shipping corridor by the end of 2025. And of course, we hope that this is just the start. And through working together on the green economy agreement more closely, we will be able to make more announcements and more progress on the GA in the years to come. Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
Thanks very much, Serena. It's kind of interesting. It sort of reminds me, I was at the Singapore Institute of International Affairs year opener a few days ago, and Chan Chun Sing, our former trade minister, gave the keynote, and sort of answered questions. And one of the things he said was that for the next 50 years, 50, the most important thing for Singapore to get right is clean energy. And he's convinced of it. That, in many ways, he's right, because clean energy is the one thing. We at the Hinrich Foundation, we cover trade research in 4 sort of big buckets: sustainable trade, digital trade, FDI, and geopolitics. And if you think about it, clean energy really cuts across all these sectors. It's truly cross-cutting. And if you get that right, it really sort of solves a lot of the issues for Singapore, one of which is water. But there are other ways to get at the same solutions, and New Zealand is reaching for a similar sort of think outside the box sort of answer to the challenges that we face today. So Stephen, do you want to take us in the other direction?
Thank you very much. Kia ora koutou katoa, as we say in Aotearoa, New Zealand. It's great to be in Singapore today, and thank you very much to the Hinrich Foundation and to the Asian Civilisations Museum for the opportunity to speak in this forum about a rather novel idea called the Southern Link. But before I go into that, I just want to put that in context a little for us. And can I also acknowledge the New Zealand High Commissioner, Gabriel Rush, who's with us this evening. No pressure on me. But let me put this in context. What we've been talking about, I think, Chun-Wei, is what makes for supply chain resilience in a world where maybe we can't rely on the old certainties of the multilateral trading system. I hope we can rely on them, Debbie. Let me say quite clearly, there is no alternative to the World Trade Organization. It has to succeed somehow, somewhat against the odds. And that is very much front of mind, I know, for the New Zealand government, but also for business in New Zealand. And smaller economies, like New Zealand and Singapore and others, feel this all the more keenly because we rely on the rules of the international system. And we're always at the mercy of larger players who on any given day might want to do something completely unjustified to us. And we have a means of seeking redress. Of course, Singapore is at the center of the world's most dynamic region and at the heart of the world's most dynamic supply chains. But New Zealand is at the end of a very long supply chain, the last bus stop on the planet, it's often been described as. But it's great for a visit, and I urge you all to come and do business with us. So for 30 years or more, New Zealand, with its partners, has sought to combat what we like to call, or don't like to remember, the tyranny of distance by negotiating ever more deeper and commercially meaningful trade agreements with our partners. We started with Australia in 1983 with the Closer Economic Relations Agreement, the best FTA that exists in the world. Our CPTPP probably comes second, we might get onto that later. We followed it up with our first closer economic partnership with Singapore in 2001. A rather large gap between those two things, but that was a seminal event for us. Do you know today with Singapore, we have 6 FTAs. We have the original Closer Economic Partnership, since upgraded. We have the P4 agreement, the precursor arrangement to the Trans-Pacific Partnership. We have the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and now we have the comprehensive and progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership. We have ANZFTA, the ASEAN, New Zealand, Australia FTA. We have RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. That makes New Zealand and Singapore amongst the most FTA'd of all countries in the world. By the way, we also have the Digital Economy Partnership, DEPA, and we also have the various pillars under IPEF, including the supply chain pillar. All of this is great. It's served us well. It's helped build the modern economy in New Zealand, and long may it continue. But maybe we have to think about some new things. And here's where this novel idea comes in that I want to talk to you about. Can we build a new supply chain? One that doesn't exist yet, but which could put New Zealand in the middle, but not at the end. This is the Southern Link. And a picture is worth 1,000 words, and so a video must be worth 10,000 words. So let me ask for 30 seconds of your time while we show you a video. So ladies and gentlemen, it starts with a simple idea. The fastest way to move goods and people between Asia and the southwestern seaboard of South America is via New Zealand. We are at the halfway point of an L shape between Northeast Asia and southwestern Latin America. New Zealand, whether through Auckland or Christchurch, provides the shortest flight distance between key Asian and South American cities, particularly Singapore, Kuala Lumpur, Shanghai, Guangzhou, Santiago, Buenos Aires, and further afield. Now, that link is fairly obvious when it comes to air routes, so much so that at the height of the COVID crisis, special flights were arranged between Santiago and Buenos Aires and Shanghai via Auckland to transport PPE and medical equipment. But you know, those flights don't exist today. We don't practice that same pattern. Even more bizarrely, these connections between Asia and Latin America often take place via North America or even via Europe. But do you know, to go from Singapore to Sao Paulo via Auckland would involve 23 hours of flying. But if you went to Sao Paulo, from Singapore to Sao Paulo via Madrid or Barcelona, so Auckland 23 hours, Madrid or Barcelona 28 hours. 5 hours extra is quite a lot when you're doing a trip like that, believe me. And from a green economy perspective, think of the fuel burn and the use of carbon emissions. But with air links come also passengers, tourists, but the goods that are held in the hold of the plane. And that's relevant for e-commerce and parcel post. And we are seeing an explosion of e-commerce between Latin America and Asia. As people want to buy the latest goods, as Latin American suppliers make use of e-commerce portals in Asian markets. So the thought is, could this be further facilitated by more and better connectivity between Asia and Latin America across New Zealand, where goods could be warehoused, stocked up, released more quickly to satisfy consumer needs? But it's not just about air connectivity. We're talking multimodal connections. The vast bulk of trade between Latin America and Asia is carried by sea. Much of it goes through North American ports. New Zealand could provide a useful alternative. And then there's data, the new green and the new black. Data can flow across modern supply chains as well, or particularly through subsea cables. And New Zealand now is the home to a number of data centers, cloud storage, and cloud computing facilities. So you have trade agreements. I love trade agreements. but you have some other ideas about facilitating the movement of goods, services, capital, people, and now data. Supply chains are what make trade agreements work. In the case of the Southern Link, you need to be thinking about CPTPP, you need to be thinking about the Pacific Alliance. It's part of the same challenge. Supply chains are mostly about business. Governments have an important role to play. They can help, sometimes they can hinder. But business has to demonstrate the viability of supply chains and make them work. In the case of the Southern Link, we've done a lot of work in New Zealand to prepare the case. We got a bit held up over COVID, it has to say, but it is coming back into focus now. There's more we need to do. And I think this is very relevant, Chunwei, to this exhibition. The Spanish galleons. This was a supply chain that existed a long time ago that came out as a result of colonization. Different drivers in the case of the Southern Link, but it's trying to achieve the same sort of thing, linking both sides of this great Asia-Pacific region that we all call home. And connectivity and resilience are the key ingredients, and indeed they are the main drivers of business development and sustainable economic growth. So I look forward to seeing all of you on a plane from Singapore via Auckland to somewhere nice in Latin America before too long. Kia ora.
Thank you, Stephen. Stephen just wrote an article for us a couple of days ago, which we published. And one of the reasons that I really, enjoyed publishing it was because, it was his idea. It carried an image that was from Visual Capitalists of the subsea cables that crisscross our planet. And if you look at the painting, I'm sorry, it's not a painting, it's a visual, but it looks like a painting because it's all in black and all you see are the colored lines that represent the subsea cables. And there are these faint lines that cross everywhere except the Pacific, the southern half of the Pacific. Mm. So clearly, if you just look at the map alone, I mean, that it sort of sums up what Stephen has been talking about. And something else that you said, Stephen, which is striking, was about larger economies and the sort of dysfunction that they've produced at the multilateral level. But really, it's about involution, which is a fancy way of saying a state of internal friction with increased complexity but very little expansion, because that's the state that we're in right now, and it's something that all of us, all of you have sort of in one way or another commented on this. Debbie, you've talked about smaller economies, Singapore. Serena, you represent one of the economies that are trying to figure out. New Zealand is another. But what do you guys think of what smaller economies can do? There's this term minilateralism that has come up. Bilaterals becoming more in vogue. We have the MC13 coming up next month. At the same time, people have got to figure out their own way forward. So, Debbie, what do you think?
About small countries.
About how smaller economies, try and navigate their way out of this situation.
Yeah, I mean, I think, if you're small, you have to be nimble, because that's how you survive. Sort of, if you think about the world as a bit of a jungle, how do you survive when you're small? You have to be nimble and flexible. You have to be creative. You have to be open, because if you're small and you're inward focused, there frankly isn't enough resources that you are likely to have internally to be able to satisfy the needs of your citizens. You can't get all of the goods and services, investment, et cetera, that you're looking for if you're small and you're closed. So that drives you to be far more outward focused just by instinct, right? But in order to navigate when you're small and you're open, you have to be super flexible and nimble, because now you are at the mercy in a little way of the current. But you're also, in order to be successful at this, you have to control your own destiny, and that requires you to have some vision of where you want to go and to be cooperative with others. And so, one of the things that I see particularly happening with smaller countries in this region, elsewhere is true as well, but especially in Asia, is that they are willing to develop cooperative approaches to new ideas. They are willing to try things and see what happens. And so if I think of a classic example in my view of how this works, Stephen mentioned it, is the evolution of a trade agreement that started as the P3 with 3 countries, Singapore, Chile, and New Zealand, and then added Brunei at the last minute to become the P4. That P4 finished in 2006 and sort of sat there with 2 empty chapters until 2008, and then all of a sudden it went from 4 members to 9 members, and then from 9 to 11, and 11 to 12, and then 12 to 11, and now back to 12. So the point here is that you start with a small group of countries who are trying to figure out how can they set rules that work for them, but that also work for potential new members. How do you make it attractive? How do you make it valuable? How do you support your businesses, because it's a trade deal? I think trade deals should support companies. How do we support our companies in developing and growing across the number of members that we have? And if we make it attractive enough, other people will want to join. So we've seen that in this region. The P4, which went, again, from 3 to 4 to 9 to 11 to 12 to 11 to 12, and has a queue now waiting to join in what is now called the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership, CPTPP. That is that evolution. And I think you see that replicated elsewhere by small countries working with their companies. What is it you'd like to see? How can we make that work for you? How can we be a partner with our own domestic constituencies and with others in these new and evolving areas? Not just the traditional trade, but potentially we add in green, climate, et cetera. We talk about digital trade. We talk about all kinds of new ways to think about workforce development, skills issues, labor force, mobility, et cetera. I think that's an important element of being small and open economies that serves all of us well. Because many times those sort of pathfinder initiatives by the smaller countries get picked up by the larger countries and then get replicated in some other way. And especially, I would argue, at a time when we have difficulties getting things done with large groups. The piece that I just did on the World Trade Organization used the analogy of trying to get everyone to go to lunch. There are currently 164 members in the World Trade Organization. There are about to be 166 members at the end of next month. Imagine in your head trying to order lunch with 164 of your staff members, right? You need to all agree on a restaurant and a menu. Like, that is difficult, right? You think, wow, it's lucky we eat at all. If it was 164 of us who all have to be satisfied, that is going to be hard. But let me compound that for you by saying, what happens if there's no boss to make a decision, right? So the World Trade Organization, member-driven, famously member-driven, the boss cannot say, we're going to go there. So you have to decide among yourselves. And then let me throw in the kicker, which is any one of you can stop us from going to lunch, right? So now we got to not just have 164 happy people, we need to have 164 people so happy that they say, yes, let's go there and let's eat this. So it's really hard to get an agreement through that kind of diverse membership. And that means, among other things, we need countries that are small, flexible, to do pathfinders, to see where can we go from here in order to get us to have ideas that then make sense to 164 or 166 countries, right? So that when you bring it back, they say, oh yeah, I've seen that in action, it works well. I would like to be part of it too. Let's all go wherever it happens to be at the time. So for me, again, why small countries? Because that's where you have the potential for innovation. And especially in Asia, we have had some extremely innovative, smaller countries that have made a difference.
Yeah. Stephen, I mean, as you know, New Zealand is one of the sort of pioneers at getting at this as well, but do you see these smaller arrangements eventually rewriting the larger picture? I mean, is there a way for them to...
Well, let me say, of course, I've already put my cards on the table about the WTO. And I think a very important element of this is that we advance these things in a WTO-friendly, compliant way. And, you know, maybe that can get us to some different plateau at the multilateral level. But I do think it's very important, you know, that we don't give in to the pessimism. I think you're right to point to the pessimism. I think we have to keep on at the WTO. I think we have to keep on being involved. We have to, for example, in relation to the very vexed situation with the dispute settlement system, a number of countries, including Singapore and New Zealand, and some other larger economies, by the way, European Union and China, have developed an alternative dispute settlement system that's in work between them. It's not perfect, but it's the best plan B we could do. So don't give in, keep on innovating, I think. And that's why the Singapore-New Zealand relationship is so critically important to us in New Zealand. We hope it is important to you. We know it's important to you too. And indeed, it's why we work so closely with our friends in Australia. It's very, very important that we maintain this innovation between us.
Right. And Serena, what's next for the GA agenda?
So I think for us, the next stage on GA, as I think I mentioned before, we are hoping to continue to plug at the implementation phase. I think there's a lot of room for us to venture into. I think there's a lot of new developments in various areas, and that's something that we hoped to be able to make small advancements. I think just going back to the point on the small economies, although Australia is of course much bigger than us, but the Singapore-Australia GA, what we saw it as is a pathfinder agreement where it is a bilateral agreement where we can experiment and find new ways of collaborating in the green sector, which will hopefully set an example for maybe other bigger economies to look at and follow, and that could then fuel the momentum for greater economic collaboration in the green sector on a larger scale at the multilateral platforms. So that's how we see the Singapore-Australia GA as being a way forward, possibly a sandbox kind of a experimental area for us to test new ideas, new areas of cooperation, and hopefully that will set the stage for greater things to come.
Thank you. We wanted to sort of open this up to the floor. I mean, I don't know if anyone has any questions. We have 2 microphones stationed to the sides of the auditorium, and then Shuk and Jiahui are also moving around with microphones. If anyone has a question, just go for the microphones or stick your hand up, and Debbie, Stephen, Serena,
My name is Shankar. I'm part of an organization called BAFT, a US-based advocacy organization for trade finance and payments. My question really is, and this is my own, not the organization, is globalization and ESG, and you mentioned deglobalization when you started off, are they opposite parts of what we're trying to achieve? Globalization means more things moving around, and ESG means less consumption of the things that cause these things to move around. Does that make sense to you?
It seems to me that Serena might want to sort of kick us off here.
Thank you very much for your question. I can see your point of view that there could appear to be some sort of disconnect between what we're trying to achieve, both on increasing globalization, but as well at the same time we want to also achieve many of these ESG goals, which includes sustainability as well. And where we're coming from, I think for the GA's what we want to hope to find out is a way for us to marry those 2 objectives in a positive reinforcing momentum, rather than to see trade and sustainability, economic growth and sustainability as at odds with each other. And that would result in us maybe delving deeper into research and development into new types of technologies, clean energy, better efficiency, and hopefully all these will bring down the costs of all these technologies that we're going to adopt. When they bring down costs, they will increase wider adoption, and that will in turn provide a positive momentum towards achieving the goals that we both want, both not sacrificing the standard of living, but at the same time making sure that our Earth still remains as healthy as possible.
Thank you.
if I could just have a quick answer to that one too. If globalization is moving things around, it's also about the moving around of ideas. And that's critically important as a means to find solutions, I think, as you just said. If you take in a trade context the movement of environmental goods and services, for example, that can provide the tools to address climate change and find better environmental solutions. That's also a product of globalization. So I don't see those two as being, at opposite ends. I do think we need a more sustainable form of globalization. And I think a lot of our economies are working towards that.
No, I think that's, I was just going to say too, it's easy when we talk about trade in particular to overemphasize trade in goods, which is important, obviously, but that's not all that trade is. So I would plea to all of you that you also think about trade in services, trade in ideas, trade in people. It's not just about trade in goods, as important as that might be.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And, it's interesting if you look at EVs. Apparently someone was telling me, recently about a class in which the question was asked, like, what industry would you most want to promote? And, you said the EVs, and that they're going to do a project on it. But then the teacher sort of asked, a sort of deeper question, like, when you produce the EVs, like, how much carbon does it take to actually produce the EVs? And that is a critical question in itself. And answering that question goes toward answering the question that you just asked, to which I have no answer. But does anybody else have a question? Yes, the gentleman at the side.
Hi, Daniel Moss, columnist at Bloomberg Opinion. Deb, in your opening remarks, you talked about the epidemic of isms to describe the current trade moment. Globalization, deglobalization, slowbalization, onshoring, reshoring. Now, many of these conversations implicitly have at their core a problematic relationship between China and, I guess if we're talking about the galleons, the Americas. What would the owner of the galleons or the crews of the galleons have made of these conversations that we're obsessing with today? Would they roll their eyes and say, same old, or would it be more, my God, what have they done?
Wow, that's a good question. I think there would be I think as we see now, a mix. So there are some who would have been specializing and who specialize now in trade lanes that are becoming problematic. Either the lane itself is problematic, i.e. sort of China to the US or the reverse, or the sector and the trade lane is complicated. You want to do semiconductors between these two markets, good luck. So there are some specific routes, some specific challenges that we face in this relationship today, and increasingly that might get bigger and broader going forward, so that it's not just about semiconductors. Pretty soon it's all kinds of things. However, in trade there's always an opportunity, and business people tend to be especially good at finding ways around an obstacle. So if I want to move things between A and B, and I'm not allowed to move them directly between A and B, guess what happens? Many business people will figure out a way to move it from A to C and from C to B. And so we end up ultimately, potentially, with this very similar kind of trade, but it's routed differently, or it's structured slightly differently. And I think that's in part what you see out of the, frankly, when I see the Galleon exhibit, I see some of that is the rerouting of something that might otherwise have taken place, because it's over a fairly long, the Galleon exhibit illustrates a fairly long period of time in which you could shift things, a problem here in the case of the galleons, a war, an actual fighting conflict, whatever. We have to find an alternative way to do this, an alternative way to get supplies, whatever it happens to be. Or in the case of today, where we have rising tensions and the risk of policy changes and regulatory changes that can upend a business model, And so you have to think about alternative routes. You have to think about how else can I get what I'm doing. And so it's not just about geopolitics. Again, we saw that in COVID, where a lot of companies were able to keep their supply chains going because they were able to shift production. Okay, if I can't get this product here, then let me restart production at another factory. Let me expand production. Let me think about alternative suppliers. And so, ultimately, although we had supply chain struggles early in COVID, a lot of companies, for a lot of things, were able to reroute their goods. They were able to rethink their services. They were able to use digital tools in ways they hadn't before to continue trade flows. And I think we're going to see the same thing now. So that's why I'm not pessimistic about the end of globalization. I think we're still going to have globalization, but I think the structure may change. And in particular, the structure changes because businesses who ultimately run supply chains are mostly smart and sensible. And if you want to get from A to B and you can't get there directly, you will figure out some alternative way to make that happen. And if you can't do it, someone else will rise up to do it. Someone who sits in group C will come up on their own, and they will come up with a way to supply things to both A and B. And so I am not convinced that difficulties mean the end of trade. I think difficulties can be challenging, certainly. They're really challenging for some firms, but others are going to be able to adapt. And that's what I think we're going to see going forward.
Yeah, that is a good question. It sort of reminds me of a roundtable that we had last year, where unwittingly we had it completely almost filled with business owners, the sort of galleon owners that you're talking about. And the galleon owners all said, well, this is a huge nuisance to us, this US-China thing. And I wish that the two of them would just make up and just get on with it so that we can get on with it. But, I echo a lot of the sentiments that we just expressed. And, when it came to the galleons, you have to sort of remember that they were part of an armada, the Spanish armada that was defeated by the British. And that in itself forced an innovation, both with the Spanish and the British, in terms of the kinds of ships that were being built. They became sleeker, smaller, faster. And in many ways, that's sort of what W is talking about. That tension in itself forces the innovation. Anybody else have? There you go.
Yeah, good afternoon. Mike Makatangay, founder and CEO of 1A Teams Consultants Singapore. Thank you very much for sharing your insights this afternoon. My question is, do you see or will there be a more aggressive multilateral ASEAN agreement? Because as we see there, even though we belong to one ASEAN family, there's still no such thing as an aggressive one ASEAN agreement. Thank you very much.
Mm-hmm. Okay, you can think about it. Because it's always challenging when you're in government and you're asked this kind of question. I'm not in government, it's easier for me. I think ASEAN has done an amazing job in many ways of developing integration, particularly around trade and goods. And they have a long history of this. And one of the things that ASEAN has done that they're in the middle of right now, so those of you who are in trade and goods, pay attention, they upgrade existing agreements. And so we are in the middle of a big upgrade to what is called ATIGA, which is the ASEAN Trade and Goods Agreement. That's an opportunity for us to think harder about what are the challenges that ASEAN has in trade and goods and fix them, right? So where do we have specific obstacles? Things like we don't do a very good job in ASEAN of dealing with non-tariff barriers of all kinds, licensing, standards, testing, et cetera. So we could deal with that. We could deal with something that's sort of green. We could say, why is it that ASEAN is not better at dealing with recycled, reused, remanufacturing? Build that into an ASEAN ATIGA upgrade and get a better outcome for the region. So there's an opportunity here for ASEAN trade and goods to increase and upgrade. They do something similar on services, investment, and elsewhere. So there are, within ASEAN, ways in which the region can become more integrated and more actually implement better commitments they've already made. Because one of the big problems with ASEAN is not that they don't have a commitment. They have a zillion commitments. But the problem is they don't actually do anything with those commitments. That's the challenge. So if we could get them to focus on actually doing what you already said you were going to do, that would be most of the way to solving your particular problem. And then the last thing that I would just say, and I think this is another benefit for ASEAN, is ASEAN has done a very good job of linking itself to other partners, right? To the whole region through RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, to major players like China, Australia, New Zealand, et cetera. And when it does that, it also works with those partners to increase integration and to think harder about what are the commitments that make sense for ASEAN and for the dialogue partners. And so that also drives ASEAN integration. And I've always said to companies, if you're having a hard time, for example, using an ASEAN agreement to trade with ASEAN, you can always use another agreement to trade with ASEAN. And in particular, this is not just because New Zealand happens to be sitting here, but you can always use Australia, New Zealand, ASEAN, ANZFTA, as an alternative way to deal with ASEAN. Because the commitments in ANZFTA are often better than the commitments within ASEAN itself. And so, thinking creatively about how to leverage these lots of agreements, lots of commitments, is one way to push ASEAN to, again, continue that integration journey. Because 10 is better than 1. So getting the 10 to work together is super important. It's part of ASEAN's sort of DNA, and the execution is slowly getting there. So keep pushing on ASEAN to actually deliver.
Serena, Stephen, do you guys have any?
No, I think I more or less agree with what Deborah said, which is that I think the different ASEAN agreements that we have serve different purposes. And for example, for Artiga, it focuses on goods, and for the investment agreement, it focuses on investment. I think that helps to focus the intention on one end, one agreement at one time, and make progress on the agreement without having to hold up progress on other aspects of the agreement. So I think there is value in having different sort of agreements, different ASEAN agreements focusing on different things. And that's how I think progress can be made better.
Just a thought that I know from a business perspective, it can somewhat be very frustrating when faster progress is not made. We have a similar discussion in APEC, Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation, a non-binding forum, of course. But for years and years, we've been trying to get progress on the free trade area of the Asia-Pacific, an idea that is so good that we thought about it in ABAC, the Business Advisory Council, in something like 2004, which means you can never kill a good idea, it just carries on. But we haven't got it yet. How do we get there? We're now realising that we actually have to take more of an ASEAN approach to this. We've got to build it up from the bottom up by making progress where we can, rather than by some top-down element. So I realise it's very frustrating for business. It's certainly frustrating for the people that I report on. So that's why business needs to keep getting into the ear of governments about the need for faster progress.
Absolutely. Is there anyone else with a question? That gentleman in the middle.
My name is Jashan, and I'm currently pursuing my MBA at INSEAD on a Hinrich Foundation scholarship. And my question is about the Southern Link concept that you shared. It was something that was known for centuries or for ages, but in terms of that not being a preferred route, I understand that the Australian and the the North American and the European influence would have basically captured that. But are there any other reasons you see that it could not have been developed in the earlier stages? Or what is the New Zealand government now planning to do in order to develop that as a route?
I think one of the problems we've had around that gap that you referred to, Chunwei, where there are no lights on in that southern part of the Pacific, is that the connectivity hasn't been there, and that the two immediate partners, Latin America and New Zealand, haven't exactly found themselves. Latin Americans tend to look north to North America, across to Europe, but increasingly they're looking towards Asia and trying to find ways of connecting. And that is the new dynamic that is coming on, because it's being built up in business by the need for faster deliveries of e-commerce. And we've got a lot of work to do. This is a business idea at the moment, but we've got a lot of work to do to prove the concept and to get people on board. But hey, we've started here today.
It looks like we are bumping up against time, but does anybody else have? Oh, there is a question. Yeah, go ahead, sir.
Hi, my name is Raj, and I do some work in the coconut industry, specifically in the Philippines. So within the Philippines, the coconut is a priority industry. It has an export value last year of about $3 billion, going across using the free trade agreements and the trade routes, adding value supposedly to about 3.5 million coconut farmer and their families within the Philippines. And while it's benefited the GDP of the country, we don't see a trickle-down effect of this at the bottom of the pyramid. So what's running through my mind while listening to all of you, and probably it's not directly relevant to what's being discussed right now, but is there something that we could do better with the globalization, the trade routes, where we have balance, in terms of like a triple bottom line? So trade is growing, business is growing, but we also see that effect being measured at the bottom of the pyramid.
That's an excellent question.
I have a few comments. Can I take this one?
Yeah.
I have a few comments that I would make. So the first one is important, which is, we obviously, I think this group is very enthusiastic about trade, but I don't think we should oversell it. In other words, I don't think we should say or should suggest that trade benefits everyone everywhere all the time, because that's not true. If you look at the economic structure of trade, trade benefits most of us most of the time in the long run, right? But in the short run, it doesn't benefit everyone. And that is a problem because we will have those who do not benefit from trade, especially in the short run. And what is supposed to happen, according to the economic theory, is that the governments are supposed to help rebalance and compensate those who do not benefit from trade. Now, one of the challenges I would say that we have been having recently is that that's not happening. So what do we see instead? We see a growing backlash in some markets against trade because it hasn't been widely shared. The benefits have not been widely shared. And I think that is something that does have to be addressed. We have to think about how do you ensure that those benefits get more widely shared? How do we ensure redistribution does take place? Because otherwise, it's very easy to blame trade for a lot of ills that are directly caused by trade and then problems that are not at all caused by trade, but nonetheless, it's a great sort of, evil presence, trade. So that's one thing I would say there. The second thing, sort of how do we improve this besides having a government that is helpful in redistribution? A second thing that's important is that it is very hard to be successful if you remain at the value of commodities and raw materials exclusively. So one of the issues that comes up all the time from governments is how do I as a government make sure that we are adding value domestically before we export? In other words, if we're going to harvest coconuts, can we do something with those coconuts before we export them? Can we make them into jelly or cake or something? Can we do something with that where we're adding the value domestically? Because what often happens with developing countries in particular is that they get stuck at the level of the raw materials and they never manage to capture the value. They send it to somebody else, they capture most of the value, and then you end up with this sort of reinforcing negative spiral around trade. So one suggestion, coconuts could be one of those sectors, is thinking harder about how do we ensure that we are adding value and creating higher priced products. And here's where I think trade is crucial. Then you can export those higher value products to markets that are more receptive to paying more for those products. Places that don't have a lot of coconuts or whatever it happens to be, whatever the delicious cake is that you're special, that's special to your region, whatever it happens to be. You need trade in order to find people who will pay for higher value products at the end. And so I think we need to recognize that trade doesn't solve all things. And in places where we are especially working with developing countries and communities that need to move up the value chain, how do we try to increase value addition at home? before we export. Doesn't mean that everything has to be that way, but the more we think about that, the more the benefits can be retained within the community.
And somewhere in there, in the answer as well, is e-commerce. I mean, to the question that you're posing. And as Stephen says, somehow you've got to get into the ear of governments when it comes to e-commerce, that getting that right is going to help you a lot, and in terms of adding the value that Debbie is talking about, that will also enhance your value in e-commerce. Does anybody else have a question? There you go.
Yeah. Thank you, panelists, for sharing your insights and ideas. I'm Maureen, and I'm an entrepreneur. After hearing all your views about trade, the agreements, and New Zealand, I was just wondering about employment opportunities going forward. So where do all of you see the upcoming employment opportunities, and especially for youth employment?
Well, can I say that to make trade work, we need people that can do this. And we need people right across the value chain of trade. And this has been in New Zealand a particular problem over the recent period. We still are short of people. I don't think New Zealand is any different. I don't know where all these people have gone, but they've all gone somewhere. But they're certainly gone somewhere other than close to us. So I think the outlook is looking good, but it's all about skills. It's all about skills, expertise, which is where we've got a lot of work to do to prepare our people, and whether it's New Zealand or Singapore or Australia, to prepare our people, particularly for the next generation economy, which comes back, I think, to the green economy in particular, to the digital economy that both of you have been talking about. This is going to require a different type of worker with different skills.
Yeah, Serena, is this something that worries you when it comes to green economy agreements? Is this going to cause more unemployment?
I think definitely it's something that we're thinking about as well. That in order for us to grow the new green sectors, we actually do need people with the necessary skill sets to be able to, for example, handle new forms of fuel safely, or they need to be able to ascertain the amount of carbon in a particular product. And I think all these are new skills that are becoming increasingly important. But at the same time, I think because the number of green sectors that we are currently seeing is so broad and so expansive, it is quite hard to pin down how exactly or which sector do we want to first focus on in terms of developing the skill sets, which is number one. And number two, who are the accrediting bodies or the type of academies that are available out there to be able to grow the skills of these new sectors and receive the necessary accreditation for those skill sets. So I think those are the issues that we're grappling at this moment. And I think that's something that we're working on.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Anyone else have a last stab? If not, I just wanted to thank our three great panelists, Debbie, Serena, Stephen. Thank you so much for being with us today. And to all of you as well, thank you for coming to this panel. And I hope you get some time to enjoy the exhibition afterwards. It's apparently there's a tour with docents available, and I'd welcome all of us at the Hinrich Foundation would welcome the opportunity to talk more with you afterwards. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.